Chapter 5 is where things begin to pick up just a tad as we maneuver through general psychology. It considers the notion of learning. At this particular stage, I'll be able to start helping you understand a little bit more about how it is you do things, why it is you do them, and what prompts you to do those particular things. To begin, I'd like to point out that there are a number of cases of feral children. And when I say feral children, I'm making reference to simply those who are wild, and we'll put that in the loosest of terms. But there are cases of wild children that are traced back for a number of centuries, at least as far as we can consider the celebrated case of Romulus and Remus. The term feral, in modern usage, refers to the number of situations human children raised by animals. Could be children surviving alone in a wilderness, children raised in isolated confinement, or children raised in confinement with little human contact. Regardless of the circumstance, children reared under atypical conditions present a very unique case of learning. Charles Linnaeus first documented cases of wild children based largely on anecdotal evidence. Colorful figures such as the Haitian wolf boy from 1344, the Lithuanian bear boy from 1661, or the Irish sheep boy from 1672, all covered both a lot of terrain and much of the animal kingdom and provided ammunition for thinkers from Jean-Jacques Rousseau to Francis Gall about the contributions of nature and nurture to human development. Other notable cases include the wild boy of Averron, Caspar Hauser, and Wild Peter. It wasn't until the well-known case of the wolf children in Midapur, Kamala, and Amala that structured psychological studies of feral children began in earnest. Captured in 1920 by a Reverend J.A. Singh and a hunting party, Kamala, who was approximately age 8 at the time, and Amala, perhaps 1.5, were seen in the presence of a wolf mother and 3 cubs and were taken as they tried to leave their den. Amala died after a year apart from the wolves, although Kamala lived until about the age of 16. During her 8 years living with humans, she was able to understand speech. She mastered a vocabulary of approximately 45 words. She could even utter 2- and 3-word sentences in addition to a wide repertoire of gestural communications. These developments did not take place overnight, however. For several years, Kamala was frightened of humans. She uttered shrieks and cries when they came close by. She was largely mute. Through therapeutic massage and dedicated attention by Mrs. Singh, Kamala grew to become an active, affectionate member of the Singh's orphanage. Now, the case of Anna provides a contrast to Kamala. She was born in 1932 and was the second illegitimate child of a rural woman. Unwanted by her parents, they tried unsuccessfully to place her up for adoption, and hated by her grandfather. Anna was then kept locked out of sight in the attic of the family home. For 6 years, she lived with minimal human contact. She subsisted on a diet of only cow's milk. She could neither walk nor talk and was extremely malnourished. After a few years of institutional care, Anna was able to speak in phrases and short sentences, although her abilities remained at the severely impaired level. She died on August the 6th of 1942 at the age of 10. Now, the challenge to learning is clear in these examples. In many cases, wild children are quadruped, and in most cases, they lack speech. Hence, the challenge of restoring some aspects of behavior, like walking upright, not eating from the floor, compound the normal challenges of learning, such as speech training, interpersonal skills, and so on. Now, in addition, previous responses must be replaced by new ones, such as Kamala's learning to eat from the table, whereas in other cases, existing cognitive processes need to be modified, such as Caspar Hauser's rudimentary speech. In all cases, wild children provide food for thought about a variety of issues related to learning as well as cognition. Now, learning specifically from a definitive perspective is relatively permanent changes that take place in behavior about or based on experience and practice. Now, stated again, largely, learning is any permanent change in behavior brought about by experience or by practice. And our prime example for this particular aspect of learning belongs to Dr. Pavlov. I'm sure you've heard of Dr. Pavlov and his dog spit. Pavlov accidentally discovered the phenomenon that we now call classical conditioning. Now, elements of classical conditioning are 4 in number. You have the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. Now, the neutral stimulus and the unconditional stimulus must be paired several times, and then the conditioned stimulus must precede the unconditional stimulus by just a few seconds and actually overlap. Now, what this truly means, you'll find a video I've loaded for you that has reference to the actual dog experiment itself, as well as another example of classical conditioning. But when it comes to dealing with classical conditioning and humans, Dr. Watson demonstrated that a phobia could be learned through classical conditioning with the use of Little Albert. I've also posted a video of the Little Albert experiment. Now, with Little Albert, he was a toddler who was exposed to a bunny rabbit as well as a rat. And he began to associate both of those characteristics together with one animal. And over a period of time, Little Albert became very startled because of a startled response that was initiated by Dr. Watson. Take a look at the video, it'll make a whole lot more sense. Now, classical conditioning specifically is usually quite selective. And what that means is that it doesn't always work with every particular sort of behavior. For example, conditioned taste aversions, as an example, are related to classical conditioning. I, for one, have never, ever, ever, ever liked English peas. It doesn't matter what you do to them, how you prepare them. It doesn't matter if they're raw. I do not like them. I have never liked them. The fact that my parents made me eat them only serves to make my dislike of them even greater. Now, part of that particular challenge at this point in my life, at the ripe age of 58, is that my body, as well as my brain, have become biologically prepared to dislike English peas. You can put them on my plate if you like. I'll leave them there for you. Again, it's about biological preparedness. Classical conditioning as a whole is the first learning stop. It involved, again, Dr. Pavlov as well as Dr. Watson. There was, with Dr. Pavlov, he paired meat powder with a bell, and what happened over time is that the dogs learned how to associate using the bell instead of the meat powder, and they would then salivate on command, basically. It's kind of like bacon. If I was to talk to you for a few minutes about bacon, some of you would have mouths that started to water, because you could imagine what the bacon might smell like or taste like. And of course, you'd have that extra saliva in your mouth. In a similar way, dogs created extra spit, extra saliva in their own mouths when prompted with the meat powder as well as with the bell. Now, what followed classical conditioning was operant conditioning. Operant conditioning comes from B.F. Skinner. I suspect there's a Bible in the video itself, and that's okay. We'll just cruise right along. Operant condition came after the notion of classical conditioning, and operant conditioning is based on behaviors that either provide a reward or avoid punishment. There are some people, for example, including somebody like Tony Robbins, the great personal coach, who would tell you that all human behavior is about moving toward things that make us feel better or away from things that cause us difficulty or pain. That would be operant conditioning. Again, operant conditioning is that type of learning in which behaviors either elicit a reward or put you in a position to avoid a punishment. Now, the elements of operant conditioning would include Thorndike's puzzle box and the law of effect, which means very simply that a response followed by a pleasurable consequence is going to be repeated. A response that's followed by an unpleasant consequence over time will not be repeated. We can start talking about parenting at this particular juncture of our time together. If you want a child to demonstrate a behavior again, provide the child with a reward of some sort. I'm not talking about a toy or a piece of candy or that sort of reward. What I'm talking about is simply a way to give the child credit for having done a behavior that is of benefit to him or her or to you. For the behavior you do not want to have repeated again, this response is going to sound somewhat counterintuitive. If you want a behavior to go away, ignore it. Now, I know that's a bit of a challenge, especially if you're in the middle of Walmart and your child is sitting in a buggy and is screaming bloody murder. I mean, to the point that people think you've cut off their arms and legs. And they are screaming and carrying on about wanting something, whether it's a piece of candy at the checkout stand or whether it's some sort of this or that from one of the aisles in the grocery aspect of the store, whatever. What I'm suggesting is that they will want something, and you'll often hear a child carrying on to that effect. Now, you've got a couple of options here. You can stick with it, ignore the behavior, and wait for it to subside. You'll have to deal with your potential embarrassment about that. You could snatch a child up out of the buggy and leave the store and abandon your buggy. That's always an option. But that might give the child exactly what the child wanted, which could be detrimental in the long run. You could also offer some sort of discipline for your child, however that works for you. I'm not foolish enough to tell you that you should or should not punish your children using some sort of spanking in some way or other. I grew up being spanked and I survived just fine. But what I am saying is that if you want a behavior to be repeated, offer something pleasurable. If you want a behavior to go away, ignore it. Now, what you do when it comes to what we call reinforcement, you strengthen a response by following it with something pleasurable. You reward with a consequence. You come to class on time. Let's say, for example, Dr. Hamilton is teaching a face-to-face class, and you come to class on time. You come to class on time all the time. Good for you. I might make mention of that at some point. You turn in your work on time. What you're going to receive for your positive reinforcement for turning in your work on time is a grade. Now, if your work is not on time, you're going to get a poor grade, which is a negative consequence, which is not what you want. So you benefit by turning in your work on time. That's considered to be a pleasurable experience because you receive a grade that's more in line with what you want. Now, over time, I'll make reference to that. Periodically, I'll make reference to the quality of your posts when it comes to discussion work, that sort of thing. The intent is to give you some kind of reinforcement. If I don't provide something positive, I will usually offer some sort of explanation for whatever reason I've offered for deducting your points. For example, your response post is only worth 5 points. If it's late, you lose 5 points. If it's not the appropriate length, you also lose your 5 points. There's not much more I can do with that. Actually, it ends up being 2.5 points, actually. But I can't do much about it in that regard. You either turn it in or you don't. But at the same time, what we end up doing is shaping behavior over time. Now, there's a process referred to as the successive approximation toward a desired end goal. Now, what this means is that we are going to offer some sort of reward for behavior that gets us close, or at least closer, to what behavior we're trying to attain in the long run. For example, let's say you have a child with special needs. Whatever those special needs are of no consequence. It could be anything from autism spectrum disorder to Asperger's. It could be significant cognitive impairment, whatever, some sort of emotional disturbance. All kinds of possibilities exist here. But what I'm getting at is if you are trying to train a behavior, If a child is not speaking, for example, and you, over time, you encourage the child to turn her head toward you to acknowledge that they hear you. A reward for that might be a piece of a graham cracker. That, at least, is if you're in the public school system. The incentives and the rewards they use often have to do with food, which are not the best ones, but they're the ones they use in the public system generally. As that behavior continues, the next behavior you want might be something after she turns her head toward you, is to be aware that the child is watching your mouth as you speak. When you can confirm that, you affirm that behavior. In other words, you give a positive reinforcement for a behavior that you want to see repeated, and you continue to add on to the behavior till over time, we hope the child gets to a place when she can speak. You have rewarded the successive approximations that the child has attained as they've moved toward the notion of being able to speak. Now, when it comes to reinforcement, it's important to remember two very, very important things. Also, be reminded there are times when some things I will tell you simply are. This is one of those times. Positive reinforcement is the application of a stimulus. That is gospel. It's no plainer than that. Positive reinforcement is the application of a stimulus. Negative reinforcement is removing a stimulus. Now, please understand, I am not speaking about punishment. I'm talking about the application of a stimulus. So in this case, we're going to speak about it using punishment as an example, but this is one of those other places, again, where it may sound somewhat counterintuitive. If you spank your child, assuming you have one, if you spank your child, you have applied a stimulus to a child's backside. We'll say for fun that you're using your hand. You have applied your hand onto the backside of your child. That is positive. You have applied a hand. Positive punishment. Yes, it sounds counterintuitive. Negative punishment would be something like timeout, when you remove them from a circumstance. You've taken something away. So again, when it comes to reinforcement, positive is to apply a stimulus. Negative is to remove a stimulus. There will be people who will squabble with me over this, and they will tell me that that spanking is negative reinforcement. No, it's negative. It's positive punishment is what it is, because you've applied a stimulus to a child. Again, please take my word for that. If there happens to come up with a test question that relates to something similar, the application of a stimulus is positive reinforcement. The removal of a stimulus is negative reinforcement. Those are the answers. They will not change. Now, punishment is any event specifically that makes the response less likely to occur. Again, we're talking about positive punishment. If you spank a child, you want to deter a behavior. You want a particular behavior to go away. My mother used to smack at my mouth when I was a smart aleck when I was a kid. Well, I'm still 58. I'm still a smart aleck. It didn't work. Now, she was not afraid to pop me in the mouth when I was much, much younger. Now, the difference with that is that she was positively punishing me because she didn't want me to be a smart mouth. Over time, there would have been occasions when it worked to some degree, but by and large, it didn't. Now, when it comes to aggression, as it relates to punishment, when you're dealing with aggression, punishment has to be carefully administered. You want punishment to adjust behavior to, over time, remove a specific type of behavior. You should always pair your punishment with undesirable behaviors while pairing reinforcement with desirable behaviors. What you want to What you don't want to happen is for your children to end up in a place we call a place of learned helplessness. There was a number of experiments related to specific types of monkeys. And what they did is that they had monkeys placed in their cages, of course. They put the cage floor, they marked it off into grids. And each one of those grids has a different color. And those grids were broken down into further grids, which simply were squares that had different colors attached to them. Now, each one of those squares had some sort of very light electrical charge attached to it, which means then there was nothing on the floor that was electrified in any way. So the monkey could come and go in and out of the cage as it wanted without any harm. Let's say that the squares were red, blue, and yellow. At one point, they electrified the red squares. So when the monkey stepped on the red square, they got a little jolt. They quickly learned that they should not step on the red square and stayed on the blue and yellow squares. Makes sense so far, huh? Next, what they did was electrify the red squares still and added the blue squares to the mix. So now the only place a monkey could go without receiving a shock is going to be to the yellow square, or the yellow squares if there was more than one. So far, so good. You get a shock when you go to this type of square. You don't get a shock when you go over there. So that's where the monkey would go. Then they threw the monkeys a curve. They electrified the entire floor. There was no place the monkey could go without receiving the electrical shock. Again, please understand, I'm not speaking about the ethical efficacy of the science project. We don't do research with animals that way anymore. It's not ethically appropriate. But for argument, they electrified the whole floor. What the monkeys then did was to sit in the corner. They would sit in the corner. They would often beat their heads against the side of the cage. They would defecate on themselves and literally became helpless. That was a learned response, which is why it's called learned helplessness. You can put your children, teachers can put their students into positions of learned helplessness. And what ends up happening is that there is no decision that a person can make that does not receive some kind of punishment. When a person is going to do nothing but get punished, that person will typically do nothing because there's no decision to make. Over time, you can also shape behavioral change using a process called behavioral feedback or biofeedback. And it is a process where they put certain electrodes onto certain parts of your brain so that you can learn using your brain to modify certain parts of your body function. For example, I could train some part of my brain to slow my heart rate by using certain electrodes that are implanted into my brain. I can lower my blood pressure, lower my pulse, increase my pulse rate, whatever. You can train your brain using biofeedback. It's extremely expensive, but it works. Now, that's just for free. Just keep that in mind. Now, there are some conditions that are shared both by operant and classical conditioning. And some of those things would include, we'll say, contingencies, to begin anyway. And contingencies, when it comes to classical conditioning, is a perceived matter between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. So if the conditioned stimulus is a signal that the unconditional stimulus is about to happen, what this means over time is that we can use a process called backward conditioning, which helps to block a particular behavior, and it will also demonstrate that contingencies can be not only at work, but it can also block a particular behavior. In other words, you can train the dog to salivate to the bell, just like Pavlov did. You can do that backward. In other words, you can untrain the dog. You can teach the dog not to salivate with the bell. That's backward conditioning. Going forward, you can, to some degree, influence. Let's say you pair the bell with the notion of salivation. Okay, now What's called second-order conditioning is a process by which you take another stimulus. Let's say you turn on a light bulb instead of ringing the bell. In other words, you can train one behavior one way, then train again to another behavior, but you can only do it twice. You can't do it a third time. Science tells us that that sort of training just does not work. Now, the other issue related to contingencies as it relates to operant conditioning is where you find difficulties related to addiction in some contexts. Not always, but in some cases. What's called continuous reinforcement. Now, people receive reinforcement in one of four ways. It's either a fixed ratio model, a variable ratio model, a fixed interval, or a variable interval. Now, what that means is that for a fixed ratio, you receive, let's say you work in a factory, and part of your factory work is that you receive pay based on how many units you build, however many that happens to be. So for every 5 units you make, you receive $1, let's say. That's a ratio. You're 5 to the employer's 1. A variable ratio would be something less desirable because you don't know how much you're going to receive for the same amount of work that you put out. A fixed interval is also similar to the fixed ratio. You know every payday when payday is coming. Is it the last day of the month and the 15th of the month? Is it the first and third Thursday of the month? That is a fixed interval. That's one. Payday is a good example for that. Variable ratios, or the variable interval, The variable interval is like pulling a handle on a slot machine. You'll eventually hit, but you don't know when the interval is coming. You don't know what the variable is, which is why gambling can be so addictive. People that you speak with will often tell you, just one more time, just let me pull one more time. And people have lost everything they own in the process of gambling because they cannot bank on how or when the matter is going to hit in their favor. Hopefully that makes a little sense. If we were in class, we could unpack it another way or two. I'll look online and see if I can find a video that will help you with that a little bit better. Now, when it comes to the adjustment of behaviors, when you have removed a behavior, let's say, is you have made that behavior extinct. Now, sometimes we encounter a process referred to as spontaneous recovery, meaning that I instantly pick up a behavior that I had extinguished at one other time. That's also a part of classical conditioning. Pavlov's dogs salivated even after the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus pairing was suspended. Extinction does not erase the learning, which is why it is recoverable. Now, extinction and spontaneous recovery in operant conditioning will depend on the strength of the original learning. It will also depend on the pattern of the reinforcement and the variety of settings in which the learning took place. It'll also have something to do with how complex the behavior is and whether the learning took place via punishment or via reinforcement. There are challenges related to stimulus control, generalization, as well as stimulus discrimination. Generalization and discrimination in classical conditioning, for example, we can refer back to little Albert. He's the best example. Go back and check that video. Generalization and discrimination in operant conditioning is when the response generalization is observed. Again, I'll see if I can find a video for you. You can have new learning that's based on original learning, which we call higher order conditioning. You can have also primary versus secondary reinforcers. Again, the particularities of those reinforcers are not so important at the moment. Just be aware that they exist. Now, when it comes to cognitive learning specifically is the learning that requires cognition, or basically learning that requires our mental process. It's an organism's unobservable thought process. You can't see me thinking. That's cognitive learning. Latent learning is when we learn something specifically now, but we don't engage it or use it or find it to be necessary until another time. Example would be Tolman's maze running rats. You ever watch any sort of mice or rats run a maze, for example, in a race? If you're looking for an example for that, look up an episode of MASH when Radar has his mouse and races his mouse against a mouse that belongs to the Marines. Now, the mouse was taught the maze, which is why they try one route in the maze that doesn't work, so they try another one, and then another one, and another one, and they remember which ones don't get them anywhere. So as a result, learning, they don't receive any reinforcement until they get to the end, and the getting to the end demonstrates that they have learned which route not to take to get out of the maze. When it comes to insight learning, Kohler noticed that a chimp, who was also in a cage, had a very sudden perception of the relationships among elements of a problem. Now, what this meant is that there was a monkey in a cage, and Kohler gave the monkey 2 sticks, and he put a banana on a stool or on a table outside of the cage. Using 1 stick, the monkey could not get to the banana. But the monkey spontaneously realized by watching and looking and quote-unquote pondering that he could attach the 2 sticks together and reach the food. That's why it's referred to as the sudden perception of relationships. I can put this stick together with this stick and reach what I'm looking for. Now, learning also will take place in, how do you put it? In sets, we would call them. You can learn sets of behaviors, for example. Harlow did a study however many years ago. Again, I'll try to find it and post it. I'll write it down. And what they did with these rhesus monkeys is that they built a wire mom, a wire grown-up monkey, and they installed an apparatus that would allow the rhesus monkeys to nurse. So in essence, they created a wire dummy that provided milk for the rhesus monkeys. In the grand scheme of things, it's not a big deal. But what they did with one monkey was to cover it with terry cloth, something soft, basically. And what they discovered is that the monkeys would go and nurse to the mother who was softer than the other one, who had no terry cloth. The monkeys learned the set of what was necessary to get access to the milk in a softer environment. Gives you an idea of how that kind of stuff works. We learn often by watching other people. Therapeutically, we refer to this process as modeling. When it comes to behavior, we refer to it as observational learning. Now, Bandura, his first name is Albert. Albert Bandura put together an experiment that helped us understand the potential for children to be violent. What they did is that they had some children. Again, I'll post that one. They had some children in a lab, in a playroom, kids playing with toys, doing their own thing. Then they played a video of some sort for the children. And in that video, someone hit what's called a Bobo Doll. Y'all don't know what a Bobo Doll is, I suspect. It is a toy that you could blow up, and it had sand on the bottom. You could hit it, and it would fall down and bounce back up. That's why it was called a Bobo Doll. They could Bobo with it. Now, in the video, there was some sort of extraordinary, some sort of violent behavior. Somebody picked up something in the playroom and hit the doll or hit somebody or whatever else in the video. And what happened to the children is that after watching this particular video, they put them in a playroom and had a Bobo doll sitting in the corner. Bobo doll wasn't bothering anybody, just sitting there minding his own business. And one young lady picked up a toy and used it as a club and began to beat the Bobo doll. She learned how to do that by watching in the video someone else beat on something. Now, that's why it's referred to as observational learning. It's also can be referred to as vicarious learning. It's a bit of a modified observational aspect. We can learn from what, again, it refers to the ability to watch from and learn from somebody else's behavior. With my own children, and I have, both of my children know that I speak about them in class, so I'm not giving away any information. My older child is hard-headed. She's 32 and is still hard-headed. Being a mother has softened that to some degree, but she's still one of these folks who, when she gets her mind made up on something, this is how it's going to be. As a result, she was very well known for not doing what was asked of her at home. So we had to figure out how to manage that. You could beat her with a stick and it wouldn't have made any difference. She'd do it anyway. Once upon a time, she smacked her sister, her little sister, on the back. Now, there's only 4 of us in the house. And I asked her, why did you hit your sister? I didn't hit my sister. Well, your sister didn't hit herself on the back. I didn't hit your sister on the back. And I know your mom didn't hit your sister on the back. You're the only one here. You hit your sister on the back. No, she never did own up to that. She learned over time, because of certain consequences that we implemented into her behavioral process, what she could do and what she couldn't do. Over time, she learned how to modify some of those behaviors. Now, my younger daughter, we used the older child's behavior to teach the younger one. We would simply ask her, are you watching your sister? And the younger one would say, oh yeah, I'm watching. And she figured out how she should not behave by watching her sister misbehave. A great story I tell about her, and again, she knows I tell it, so I'm not giving away any significant information. She stole some money from me. She took a $100 bill out of a desk drawer. Why the $100 bill was in there doesn't make any difference. But she snatched it like I wouldn't know that a $100 bill was gone. I knew that Nicole didn't take it, the younger one. I knew that Rebecca, my wife, didn't take it. I hadn't taken it, so I knew Allie had it. I just didn't know what she did with it. I asked her, I didn't take your money. And we went through this rigmarole. So I'm friends with the chief of police where I live. So I called the chief of police and I said, I want you to arrest my child. And of course, he laughed and said, what did she do? So I told him exactly what she did. She took my money. He said, do you trust me? Yeah, I trust you. Then I'll take care of it. Okay. So I let it lay. And what ended up happening is that he went to school. She was in high school at the time. He went to school, had her paged on the intercom. So she had to live through, Allie Hamilton, you need to come down to the office, that sort of thing. And she went to the office, and the chief of police met her there and ushered her into the principal's office. The principal had made himself scarce. So he had gone off to do something else, and he walked Allie into the office and shut the door and looked at her square in the face and said, your dad wants me to arrest you. What did you do? And of course, when confronted like that with legal authority, she collapsed and went to pieces and started confessing stuff she probably hadn't done before. But she told him that she had taken the money. He also told her that I didn't know what she had done with it, so I was foolish and might have assumed that she had done drugs with it or used it to buy drugs. So he also told her that when she got home that I was going to have her do a drug test, which I had available for her when she got home. She did okay till it got to the drug test part. When she had to pee in a cup, she got a little rattled. She told what she did with the money. So we figured that out. We figured all that out, but not before she had to do a urinalysis to test for drugs and had to deal with the challenges related to talking with the chief of police at the high school, other people knowing that she had been summoned to the office, that sort of thing. She never stole any more money from us. Now, she might have stolen money from somebody else, but she never stole it from us. She learned very quickly. The younger daughter learned quickly. Don't snatch dad's money. He gets a little excited about that sort of thing. Now, learning is a phenomenal thing, and we're just touching the surface of how learning works. I've given you some examples. I'm going to throw in some more videos so you can see some of these experiments. Some of them actually in their original format. They'll be black and white. You'll have to watch them closely. It's kind of hard to see exactly what's happening. The original Bobo Doll experiment for sure is in black and white. Little Albert's in black and white. And of course Pavlov's experiments are in black and white. Original ones anyway. But I mentioned earlier, general psychology, one thing that will occur is that you will begin to learn why you do what you do when you do it. You'll be able to unpack certain types of behavior you exhibit. Great example. If you have someone in your home, male or female, makes me no difference, who comes in the house and starts to take off their clothes at the front door and leaves a trail through the house. Maybe it's a backpack, maybe it's their shoes and their socks and their clothes or whatever, and they just start leaving stuff. They just drop it where it goes, or where it sits. And then you end up with a mess in your house first, and then often whoever dropped whatever it is they dropped comes looking for it because they will have assumed that somebody has picked it up. Well, this is how this rolls. If you can stand it, leave it in the floor. They ask, Mom, where's my backpack? I don't have the foggiest idea. It's probably right where you left it. Where did they leave it? Where did I leave my backpack? I don't have a clue. It might be in the yard. It might be wherever it happens to be. But you don't assume responsibility for somebody else's behavior. In a similar way, dinner, assuming you eat dinner, takes place, we'll say, between 6 and 6:30. At 6:31, the kitchen is closed. There is no other food available until breakfast. My older child didn't want to eat when the rest of us were going to eat. She only didn't have dinner one time. It was a long time till breakfast time. She got the message, and she ate during the eating period of time. She also ate what was given to her to eat. I don't want that. I want a sandwich. It's a long time to breakfast. Have a nice hour or two, whatever. She might have changed her mind and wanted to go ahead and eat what we had offered. Nope. That opportunity has passed. Again, that's about simple consequences for simple behaviors. Other examples you would probably be able to come up with that are similar, that give folks a real good understanding of why and how people behave in certain ways. Just be aware of yourself. Start paying attention to when and what it is you do. And then maybe you can figure out what it is that motivates the behavior. When you can figure out what motivates the behavior, you're better able to decide to what extent you either want to modify the behavior or not modify the behavior. That's entirely up to you. Again, if I can provide any other information, any other sort of questions I can answer, I'm happy to do that. Let me know. You can send me an email. I'm not hard to find. Have a good afternoon.